In this episode of Luke Overthinks, we are looking at 2 Target novels, not 1. So I said last time that this time we were going to be looking at the Witchfinders, which we are indeed. But since then, and since I had my first stab at reviewing Witchfinders, I've also finished Resurrection of the Daleks. So I thought we would do both in one. On the face of it, they're very different stories, but they both have something in common, which is the idea of locking the bad people or bad guy up whilst prolonging their lifespan. And is that a good idea? In short, no, it's a bad idea. So we'll start with the Witchfinders. I recorded a whole review of this story yesterday. I stood in front of this camera for about half an hour waffling on. And I decided not to give you that because it was needlessly waffly and long. So what I've decided to do instead is to give you a much briefer review of my general thoughts about the book. And if the chance arises to sit down and do a proper podcast with somebody else who's read it, who wants to kind of really get into the nitty-gritty of some of the moral issues raised by the story, then that would be great. Because there are some really interesting questions brought about, or were brought about in my mind by reading this novel. But let's just quickly review it. This was a story, if you recall, I've talked about this a couple of times before in preparing for this book to come out, this story lost me at the moment where the Doctor mishandled the Bible. In the TV version, she essentially implies that love thy neighbour originates in the New Testament, which it doesn't. Jesus is quoting the Old Testament when he says that that is the second greatest commandment. That's how I felt watching the episode. Subsequent commentary on Twitter pointed out to me that it also essentially is an anti-Semitic trope. The idea that you have nasty God, Old Testament, thou shalt not suffer a witch to live. Nice God, New Testament, love thy neighbour. And this is a trope that Christians have been guilty of peddling throughout the centuries, much to our shame. First thing to say is that's been fixed in the novel. Just a slight tweak to the dialogue, just to say, thou shalt not suffer a witch to live. It also says, love thy neighbour. Not making that distinction between Old and New Testament, just says the Bible says both of these things. Boom, right. Let's move on. So basically the book allowed me to really see the story afresh and to enjoy it without those negative lenses that coloured watching the TV version. That aside, I would still say that this is probably the better version of the story because there's just more going on. We get a nice prologue explaining how the Moraks ended up in the prison, which obviously wouldn't have been appropriate for the TV version because it would spoil where the story goes, but because I think the assumption is that the majority, if not everybody reading this book, will be people who've seen the TV version. And in that sense, these modern targets are finding a very different audience to the original audience, which was, you're never going to see this again on TV, buy the Target book. This is much more, you've seen it on TV, now have the expanded version, in most cases, from the original writer of the story. And this allows Joe Wilkinson to fill out some of the backstory. I haven't gone back to rewatch it, but there are definitely bits in it that I was like, was that in the TV version? So not being as familiar with the original, there are some bits that I'm pretty sure that wasn't in it and that's been added and that backstory has been fleshed out. But there's just more stuff to enable you to get into the minds of the characters, to empathise with them, even with the more villainous aspect. And like all the best historical stories in Doctor Who, it's a jumping off point for going, this is a bit of history that I wasn't aware of. In spite of the fact that I grew up in Sheffield and Yaz and Ryan seem to know about this from school, I certainly didn't. I'm a bit older than they are. So maybe if you're from Sheffield and you're maybe in your 20s, did you do the Pendle Witch Trials at school? Because we certainly didn't. We were much more like Eyam, the plague village in Derbyshire, was our kind of local history stuff. And I suppose that leads me on to perhaps my only real disappointment with the story, and this goes for both versions, is that part of me really wishes this was a pure historical. I would love for a modern showrunner to have the courage to just say, let's try the format again. I know the longer the show goes without anybody doing it, we're obviously big fans of it, but the longer the show goes without anybody doing it, the more difficult it becomes. Because this is a format that we haven't seen since 1967. Black Orchid aside, we can debate whether that fits into the same category of the only sci-fi element being the Doctor and companions turn up and have an adventure. And it's basically TARDIS arrives at the beginning to get them into the situation, they get separated from the TARDIS, and then they have an adventure in history, being reunited with the TARDIS at the end of the story and moving on. That was the 60s historical format. And yes, they did move into the whole other things going on with the Time Meddler and things like that. But generally that was the format. And I would love for the show to do that again. Now, obviously, the final act of this story would have to be completely rewritten because there wouldn't be the whole alien thing. It's quite clear that Beckett would have run a witch trial whether there'd been alien involvement or not. So there's still a story there to be told that would have been, I think, equally interesting. But that is not a complaint about Joe Wilkinson. It's not a complaint about this story, really, because that's the world in which Doctor Who is being made today, and they don't make those stories anymore. I just wish they would. But the story as it is, there's actually very little in terms of like once the Morax turn up to when they're vanquished. It is a very short period of time, so it could easily be rewritten. I'm going to stop waffling about that now. The focus of the story much more is Willa. We see a lot more through her eyes. There's a great moment from Yaz early in the story which resonated very much with me. Almost made me cry, actually, because of how it related to her experience of being bullied, related to my experience of being bullied as a kid. That really got to me. There's an interesting coda to the story. That's the bit I don't want to talk about because that's the bit that's definitely not in the TV version. And that's one of the many issues that I'd love to talk with somebody else about in a more long-form podcast. It's a nice tie-in to a previous era of the show, if you like that. I'm just not bothered either way. It was fine. It was okay. So overall, I would thoroughly recommend this novel, particularly if, like me, you weren't particularly fond of the original TV version, particularly if you like grappling with history, morality, the interplay of those things, and how Doctor Who interacts with those things. It's really great at providing some food for thought. So on to book 2 of this review, Resurrection of the Daleks. I think I have a lot less to say about it. So I've already reviewed Revelation of the Daleks. I read that first. Have a look up there for my review of that. These have obviously both been out in hardback for 2-3 years now. And so I've seen murmurings and rumours about what people thought of them at the time. And Resurrection got properly slated. And mostly it deserves that reputation, sadly. As I said with Revelation, one of the problems with Revelation is that the Doctor doesn't really get into the action until the end of part 1 of a 2-part story. A 45-minute 2-part story. So there's a whole swathe of him trying to get to the action. And they would slightly fix that, as I said, by moving that cliffhanger earlier in the book. Resurrection has the opposite problem in that this is to all intents and purposes, a 4-part story. It would have been a 4-part story. Not going to rehearse the whole why it ended up being a 2-part broadcast, but it's generally been released as a 4-part story, and that's how I've always experienced it. And it takes a while for the Doctor to get into things with being stuck in the time corridor, but he's well into the thick of things by the time you get to the end of part 1. However, the end of part 1 in the book doesn't occur until page 72 of about 180. So, because they would spend so much time setting up the world of the space station and so much time waffling on about the time corridor and having the Doctor escape from it. And that's a really frustrating thing. There's also the weird decision, I don't think this is much of a spoiler because it happens very early on. There's a weird thing that he's decided that the space station on which Davros is imprisoned is the Vipod Moor. Now, whether that's supposed to be the Vipod Moor of Slipback or not, I don't know. Seemingly it doesn't quite fit with the continuity of Slipback because of what happens in Slipback. I mean, it's a long time since I've read or heard Slipback, so maybe it does. But even then, Slipback contradicts Terminus, so I don't know how it would fit with it. Anyway, I'm just waffling about continuity, and I don't really care. If he wants it to be the Vipod Moor, it can be the Vipod Moor. It doesn't make any difference to the story. But overall, it's a really uneven book. As I say, the first episode is really stretched out and overwritten in many places. In other places, it's massively underwritten, and you're like, whoa, you've described like several scenes of the TV version in like 3 lines. Whoa, I'm in sort of whiplash from the change of pace. And yes, you can play Saywood Bingo with this in exactly the same way you can play it with Revelation. You will get Spiel Snapes, you will get Tim Klavik, you will get the Minds of Raga, you will get Pteroleptals several times. Because Saywood's like, yes, if we're going to drain the Doctor's mind, we're going to mention the stories that I wrote, aren't we? Yes, we are. I'm not going to begrudge him. He can do what he wants. He's written the book. He's taken the money. He's gone. We've bought it anyway as fans. So it's our own stupid fault. If you like Resurrection as a TV story, this isn't as good. If you dislike Resurrection as a TV story, this will not enhance your opinion of it. And also the end is just weird. If you've got to the end of this episode and you're really looking for recommendations as to which of these two you should buy, it's definitely the Witchfinders. If you're a completist, you'll buy both of them. So you're probably not really going to... What I say is probably not going to make a great deal of difference. But anyway, that waffle is my opinion of the two books. I hope you've enjoyed that. Next time, I don't know what I'm doing because it depends on what I've read and what I decide to do an episode on next. So I'll see you next time with another Luke Overthinks Something.